Welcome. I'm Rich Cherry, I'm the Deputy Director of the Broad Art Foundation, also co-chair of Museums in the Web, and I'm completely blocking everything, so just check it back. And this session is a forum to have a discussion about email archiving and preservation and access. And what I want to start off with is what I see as the problem, and I'm sure that my co-panelists will chime in and tell me that I'm wrong, but the issue as I see it is that museums, and in particular I'm going to be talking from kind of the art museum perspective, have been using communication mediums for many years to converse with artists, with collectors, with donors, in relation to the content that they have within their institutions. And previous to email, that communication has been taking place on paper. There are letters that go back and forth between curators and artists and directors and donors about the collecting of the objects, the collection of the objects that they're actually putting together. The shows that they're exhibiting those objects in, the things that have happened around those objects, the stories that exist. And over the last 20 years, with the advent of email communication, those communications have more and more been taking place in the electronic realm. And museums do their research and their study and their work based on a lot of those paper archives that exist from 20, 30, 40, hundreds of years ago. And we have this widening gap of a lack of knowledge that's becoming more prevalent as email from the early days is starting to disappear, or has already disappeared, or as I was talking with one of my panelists a little earlier, IT guys, the IT departments are saying, if a person leaves work, they're moving that information off of the Exchange server or whatever email platform they have. Conversions are taking place between one system and another, and that material is slowly disappearing a lot of times because the IT director is saying we don't have any storage for this, we don't have any way to deal with it, and in the places where there might be some thought to the historical value of that, even if the email is printed out and then put into the archives, you're losing a lot of the ability. You're basically reversing the process that most museums are trying to do with everything else in their possession, which is to take that physical object and digitize it and make it more accessible. And that's the issue that I kind of want to have a conversation about. And as I was doing a little bit of Googling about some things earlier today, I ran across this email on the MCN list where someone was asking about archiving, corporate memory, that kind of thing. And the response was, go check out our email archiving project at the Smithsonian website. And so I was like, oh, cool, I should check on that again, see what, refresh my memory. And of course, the problem was that wasn't there. So it's not, this problem, well, we're going to talk about email as kind of indicative of all the electronic communication and all the electronic records that are actually being produced, and whether, in 20 years, any of them will be available for the research that needs to be done for the shows and the books and the things that museums do that are related to that communication. So what I try to do is break it down into a couple of different pieces to talk about. And one of the outcomes that I want to have out of this process is the ability to have a larger group of people that are very interested in this and that want to put some of their institutional resources around developing a project to actually go out and solve some of these problems, or try to solve some of these problems, or at least come up with the best practices that we can tell museum archivists and museum curators to take to their IT folk and say, these are the things we're supposed to be doing, and these are maybe the low-hanging fruit that we can actually accomplish. Does anybody want to add anything to that?
Yeah. So Rich and I work together a lot. I serve as sort of informal sounding board to him. When he first started talking about this problem, I was not particularly interested in it. It's not the sort of thing that it's not in my sweet spot. And more to the point, I felt very strongly, given what I know about archival practice, that and but not specifically email archival practice, that there was a lot of work being done on this in other sectors, and that in fact our concern should be to keep an eye on what other sectors were doing, spending much more money, corporate entities in particular. As we began to dig into it, I realized that there were a large number of sector-specific problems that we would probably want to address and sort of layer on top of what people are doing in other spaces, and that actually becomes our task. And that some of those problems are about, terminology, language, the kinds of things that we, the nature of the content that we create, and the difficulty of identifying it in a large archive. So the discoverability problem. But the other is that we have very particular kinds of workflows. So if you start to talk to people who are doing email archiving in corporate entities, there are very specific rules, and you get paid to follow those rules. And in museums, people don't get paid enough to follow rules, or they just don't. I don't know what it is, but those workflows, and curators are secretive, and conservators are secretive, and so that we have institutional sort of organizational problems that we have to overcome in thinking about ways to solve this problem specifically for museums. Does that make sense?
It does. I would only add that, just following on what Rich says, in natural history museums, what's really being discussed in email quite frequently is sort of the taxonomic order of the planet, and genetic sequences. So that involved in that correspondence is really the entire workflow about what might be related to what, and what researchers have checked out, and so on. And so, in many ways, in natural history museums and science museums, the stakes can be even higher, like more immediate in impact. So, the problem is sort of pan museum as far as I can see it.
Yeah.
And to shine in on that, I'm going to repeat exactly what Rich just said, is that's been a long, complex issue for IT, particular IT, who deal with the storage, who deal with all the servers and so on and so forth. And one other thing we find is that when it comes to archiving, you either store everything or you store nothing, and when you store everything, it becomes a big set of data that has to be searched, and when you're dealing with that much data, it becomes almost impossible to search it, at least in a reasonable time frame. So I'll give you guys a real example, and I'll leave some detail out because we're being recorded. But we had a director left recently in the last year, and when the last month, as he was leaving, he was working on this big project with the city. And when he was getting ready to leave, he did what normally users would do, just clean out his mailbox. And which is fine, because we have a policy that states that everything you create is IMA's property, but we never state anything about you can't delete whatever you created. So it's okay. So and his act wasn't malice by any means. He was just doing the normal thing. But after our new director started, he sent an email, hey, I want all the information related to the conversation that previous director had. And it's been over 6 months. We deleted it. He deleted it, and that's been erased from server. So we had to go through a whole process of restoring tape and getting all that. And lucky us, we did have it, because it's been within 6 months. But had it been longer than that, it would be no way of recovering any of that conversation. So, and that's the reason we're bringing this conversation to the forefront, so we could all shine in and see if we could come up with a solution for that.
What do you think, Leo?
Yeah, we need a solution too.
All right, so I'm going to start off talking about institutional practice and how actually reach out to the audience and the panelists and talk about, who is archiving email and what does that mean at your institution or someplace that you've worked before.
We use Lotus Notes.
We are trying to record. We have very specific reasons for wanting to.
I can speak on it.
And we're going to
use Lotus Notes in our corporation, and I'll turn it down a little bit. And the problem is that the archiving is either manual or server hosted. And what happened is, because of the way things started out with Lotus Notes 4 point something, it ended up being local archiving only, which means that A, we lose access to it from the server level, and B, if something goes wrong with the PC, it's gone. Then we moved that onto a user backup drive, but still, even though we back up that particular network drive, we still have lost access to the information on a generic level.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And the reason we haven't done certain things that would make it easier, it's been politics even, and I hate to call it politics, but within the IT department there's been differing views about how it should be done. And it's only going to be when something can't be found and it's critical to a business process that we're actually going to do a real major evaluation of that.
So just to restate that for the microphone, Graham is with a science museum, technology center, and the idea of email archiving there is that, you know, from a manual process or even from an automated process, it's a local implementation on the workstation. And the loss of access is a problem for that, as well as the loss of disaster recovery ability. And I think, you know, while he's using Lotus Notes, the Exchange side of that is very similar in that you can have, unless you're implementing a system in the back end to actually do it, there are ways of doing it. You have this problem of an email archiving going to a PSD file, which is locally stored on a machine, which then you do not have access to from a you know, alternate side.
And I want to make sure that I'm clarifying what you do. You're talking about bulk email archiving practices. That is to say, you have no specific mechanism for identifying emails that have a particular type, representing a particular kind of knowledge. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is bulk.
Mm-hmm.
It's done automatically from the user level.
Right. Right. Right.
The local
Right.
email account says,
Workstation.
put it here.
Yep.
Because
Yep.
it's older than 6 months.
Right.
Is there actually anybody here who has anything other than bulk emailing practices in place? You?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I mean, only because projects go multi-year for me, frequently.
So this is a personal thing as opposed to an institution.
Institutional.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
This is personal.
Right.
Okay.
And departmental wide.
Right.
So it's essentially, you know, sort of chronological, and then within a year, it's project-based, so that the correspondence is indexed under a subject. And the beauty of that system for me is that it is backed up on the server. It's not local to my workstation.
And so one of the solutions that kind of exists like that, in fact, I just took over from someone else at the Broad, and who had been taking his emails, saving them to folders on his regular My Documents storage array, which means, you know, on a current desktop, you can search through them and you can find certain things, or you could, you know, actually just click through and find a folder that you think is the right folder and look in that and try and find things. So that's definitely basically for all of us, that's a doable scenario, but it creates this disconnection of that it isn't really connected to any institutional practice. It's really on individual users, and as we all know, you know, I mean, we're
In a Bell shop, they'd still be thrown.
right.
Yeah.
You know, we have the advantage. You know, Dell has the advantage of Dell has the advantage of being fairly technical and being able to do that, and a lot of users, first of all, would probably not have a successful implementation of that locally, or might not. And, you know, the loss kind of to the museum, who is kind of trying to file some other practice, might be that, a pretty common practice is that when people leave, you dump all their email into a file, PSD file in the case of Exchange, and you move that onto the server. And sometimes you give access to the next employee that's taking over for them, but you don't really manage that in any effective way. And then, so that would actually create, in that scenario, you'd have some stuff in the PSD file, some stuff in their folders, again, creating a different kind of problem for the person that's coming on after them, and not really solving any problem for the larger things. The question over here?
Yeah, so we're a fledgling institution. We're only five members deep. But right now, for a practice, we make it mandatory for every single email that's sent to be BCC'd to a cache, to a catch-all. So, and and that's for future. In the future, the way we're going to have our system set up is that institutionally, Individuals are actually going to be artifacts. They're going to be, so we bucket artifacts into 3 categories: physical, digital, abstract. And individuals in the museum are abstract artifacts. Individuals outside of the museum are abstract artifacts. And so we can appropriate these emails, depending on who sent them or received them, to that.
Which institution is this?
This is the Seattle Interactive Media Museum.
Awesome.
Very interesting.
We're a startup video game museum, and these are some things that we're trying to figure out. It's a lot of theory right now, just because we don't have institutional capacity to lay all this stuff down. But this is the way we're thinking of things.
Yeah, well, it's
Everything is an artifact.
And I think it's you know, it probably goes right along with you guys having, you know, artwork or, you know, collection objects that degrade the same way an email might, right? I mean, so you have the same problem of being able to access that email later or run that video game
Exactly.
in an emulator or something like that.
Yep.
So it was a
I was just going to say, we've got an Outlook add-in that at launch looks at everything over a certain date, and you can't actually go in and start working with your email. It's a pop-up until you have designated each one of these old emails into a managed folder. And so we have a set of managed folders. Anything that's over, I think, 3 weeks old, I have to dispose of it item by item, either in the trash or one of the managed folders. Once I've done the last one, I can then get into my email and start working.
Well, you're still
and how did that come about? I mean, because that's pretty tough on the users
That's
to a
pretty
certain
tough.
extent.
Exactly, and the end story is what people did is within the managed folders, they just created a catch-all folder, and then they would select all and drag it into there, and put it in the subject related
Which is
folders like
one
this.
way of, I mean, still creates a solution to a point.
Yeah, it does to a point, but then you've just got this big jumbled
Yeah.
mess
Right.
again. And so I guess the point that I'm getting to is you can try to put in very proactive solutions, but human nature is to find a
Yeah.
workaround to do whatever is easiest for you.
What's the institution?
It's a client that I was formerly with. It was a family office for,
Okay.
yeah.
May I ask you that? Are you actually storing that folder into outside of their mailbox, so it's not waiting
Is it
on
on
their?
Exchange?
Yeah, it's on Exchange.
Yeah.
Is it like a public folder? I mean,
What was the add-in?
yeah.
It's called LEAP, L-E-A-P, something email archive protocol.
Okay.
So we recently just, after years of lobbying, actually just hired an archivist to start helping. Since we're now in the process of a physical move, you know, her big emphasis, at least initially, is going to be on the physical records. And one of the things that really helped to drive this decision to finally get the funding to get this person on board was that we were in an e-discovery situation just about 6 months ago. And
Legal?
Legal, yeah. And you know, it actually went back 5 years. And so it was a real challenge going through PSTs of people that had interacted with this individual. It took us like about 3 weeks of, you know, digging through PSTs, you know, doing searches to finally be able to, you know.
Who was us? Just out of curiosity, was that IT?
It was IT. It was IT.
So in fact, you were charged with doing this without any specific knowledge of the subject matter.
That's correct. That's correct.
Was there a hand over here?
So there were 3 hands.
One of the things that I think that they were mentioning too is Exchange does it is journaling. It's that thing where I think a lot of law offices and healthcare providers have to do it too, where they keep track of all the email going in and out, and it keeps a record of that stuff. Also, I recently started the Office 365 thing, and they're building it into their thing, which
Yes.
is beautiful. I mean,
Right, because then it's a hosted version. of
Yes.
that.
right, yeah.
Yep. Casey.
We're going to spin up an actual Exchange archive
Right.
within the Exchange 2010.
So when I was at the Guggenheim, we did start implementing right before I left an email archiving solution. I don't know how far they got, but it was one of the big feature sets that we were using as a sale to that, you know, to get users interested in using it. Was at the time Exchange was a little tricky about getting over a 2 gig email store. Not that it's much better now, but I mean it was really bad back then. And this was, and we had people with 10 gigs of email data, including the director, who didn't want to lose anything. And this system allowed you to move it offline, made it more searchable, because at the time we didn't really have desktop search, and actually, you know, preserve the attachments and all of that, and allowed you to search through that out in the offline system. That was nice. You had your hand up?
I mean, I think part of it too is mapping and linking retention schedules to electronic records, which is
Yeah.
a lot of institutions don't map. And I
Right.
think a lot of museums especially have analog retention schedules and therefore think it's complete.
Right.
When
Yep.
your electronic records are not mapped to a retention schedule.
This is a really, really
Right.
interesting point, really interesting.
Because it's
yeah.
actually, it's, we're talking about digital archivists and sort of appraisal of electronic records. And I think for museums and institutions that already have a retention schedule, that work is somewhat done. But it's a sense of mapping it to electronic
Yeah.
records. And because it is at a user level at this point. And I don't know about bulk archiving, but when you're talking about, lots of data and lots of email and parsing it out to some sort of context, you do need a retention schedule that maps it to current functional analysis of the museum.
Yep.
And how that's mirrored in what records are useful versus what records can be deleted.
Where are you?
The Whitney.
Oh, great.
So I'm curious, so how many of you do have retention schedules for your physical?
And how much of those are those for the record management? That's usually like you keep it for 7 years and then it's out.
It depends on the context of the record.
Right.
Right.
Well, it depends on the department within the museum.
Right. That's,
Pardon me?
wait,
It depends within the museum.
Which
Business office, we're great at it because we don't want to have the record.
Right.
Legally, we don't want to have it.
Right.
And we said we could destroy it.
Right. Yep.
Like you say, other departments are horrible at it.
Yeah.
yeah, Coven.
Well, I actually think context is the critical question. I mean, because we're talking about generating a lot of material that doesn't need to be retained at all.
Right.
And some that has to be retained essentially forever because they become part of a curatorial record,
Right.
record or something like that. And so, but we're just talking about such an enormous scale. For me, the idea, I would love to have an archivist, but the idea of a sort of post facto deciding what goes with this schedule and what doesn't just is impractical. Like, that will never happen for us. Which is why I actually love the idea of a single blind cache.
Right.
Because something like that, now I can apply some degree of machine learning, where
Right.
at least I can say, when it has these characteristics, it goes into these pots, and and these
Yeah.
folders just automatically expire after X months, Y years, or whatever, and these are retained
Yeah,
in perpetuity or whatever.
That makes tons of
I love
sense.
that.
I think yeah. I mean, this is the big fork in the discussion, and the place where I think we have to decide what it is that we really need to do, and what somebody else is doing. We just have to kind of figure out what the best practice is, and it's in the knowledge archiving that that we have to have this discussion. I think, not email archiving, which
Right. I mean, I think to a
yeah.
certain extent that's the starting point, and then we talk about the two things that kind of come out of that are basically three things: preservation, access, and privacy. And so when you think about these email stores and we look at the practicality is pretty much if we could capture everything.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the most practical way for the museum to start.
But the least useful.
Well, not necessarily.
From the point of view of knowledge.
The least useful from if you don't do anything else after that. So in other words, you have a big bucket, you have everything in there. It's your file storage that you just send boxes into, and nobody looks at them, and they just go on the shelf, and there's no indexing, and nobody knows what's there.
I was just going to say, the reason why we have a catch-all again is because we don't have the institutional capacity to build the systems that we really want to have put in place. We essentially want to make virtual inboxes for every person, and essentially what they have on their computer is really just a facsimile of what's virtually on the system in their own kind of column, their own personal cache that stays there indefinitely.
Right. I think, but if you think about what a museum actually does, in a lot of cases, it doesn't involve just one person in a silo.
Right. And
so, in the big scheme of things, there's stories to be found and to be told and to be researched across multiple users within that context. So, a exhibition happens at a museum, a bunch of people in the museum are working on that exhibition, and they're corresponding with people outside of the museum to actually make that happen. They're corresponding with the video game artist, with the video game maker, and all of that information is happening on a number of levels. There's financial levels that are actually happening, there's research levels that are happening. All of those things are going to be important to someone who's looking back and doing the retrospective, the next book, the things that they want to do on that. And so that actually kind of gets ahead of a slide here, which is talking about then access and how do you kind of maintain that.
Sure.
maintain some of those informations, the threadings that are going on with emails where a person is replying, they're changing the subject heading maybe because they want to make sure the person sees it in their email box, but yet it's still connected to the last email in a certain way. And so the idea that I've been thinking about, that's been kind of bumping around in my head, has been based on Watson, which is the computer that recently, or a couple of years ago, played Jeopardy. But what one of the real intents of IBM in using that is to, right now they're using it to mine medical research and create tool sets for doctors to be sitting with a patient and have access to all of the research that they've never had time to read as they actually query the patient and ask them about, you know, certain conditions and fill in the blanks on a form. And so
That's comforting.
well, I mean,
learning about
it's no different. It's no different. I mean, the big difference is that, of course, it's someone health. But I mean, you know, when you think about kind of the amount of stuff that goes on within our field that we don't know about, that everybody doesn't know about, you know, it's kind of some of the same problems. Or within a big institution where there's a lot of things that are going on, and people on the board are going like, we should do this, and a lot of people are saying, yeah, we do that. You know, so pretty typical scenario. So the idea of what kind of tools could actually be built on top of that giant aggregated store that allow the surfacing of the kinds of information that we want to get access to. And we've kind of jumped over one thing, is how can we keep that data, kind of that aggregated store, around for an indefinite amount of time, whereas you know, most of the commercial systems are really, while they're being upgraded and kind of moving along a migratory path, the actual goal of them is to keep the email for the 7 years, allow access during that time, and make sure you get rid of it afterwards. And they don't think about keeping email forever or keeping those relationships forever, or really being able to understand it and kind of use it for something later. So I'd like to open up to kind of what people think might be some of the ways that we actually do look at, well, let's go back and start with preservation. Actually trying to keep that object for an indefinite period of time, and what people, you know, kind of what other things that we work with are like that, and what's being done about it.
Well, and I would add to that the question of the ways in which the email content that knowledge that we're trying to preserve may interact or need to be cross-tabulated against other kinds of items that we store. Because, I mean, it's, you know.
Or things that we don't preserve, like website content, or that we don't do a good job of preserving, like website content.
I was just going to say that's just either passive or active metadata abstraction, and just appropriating different tags to that email and being able to search through those tags. And if you can't find what you're looking for through the tags, then you do a full text search on the whole email.
Well, I think if you think about it in the bulks context, nobody's going to be, it comes back to the example of just trying to get people to put them into a few folders. Right. Trying to get them to tag without using some kind of automation probably isn't going to actually happen. Right. So my thought is that the full text search is kind of what gets used for discovery for legal cases, but it's kind of a pretty ineffective hammer. Primarily in the sense that you're going to get way more false positives, I think. I mean, that's just my opinion. More false positives than not. You're going to be searching for a broad term that's going to give you too many emails that aren't useful, and therefore when we try to use this tool set later on for a curator, they're not going to want to use it because it's not even as effective as a Google search.
I think traditional full text search isn't going to get you there. I think you're looking at some form of computational linguistics applied to the data set.
I mean, I tell you, our experience with those key terms, we just had like key terms from the attorney. I mean, it was amazing, and the massive information. We're like, oh, this is what you wanted, great, here you go. But it really, at the end of the day, it was really challenging.
Well, and you're compounding it with batch of threads, so you could have that exact same email replicated in 15 different people's mailboxes.
Right.
So,
if you store those as discrete items.
Right, and so everybody's going to have copies of this, so you can lost that email, kill you. The other one is, I just did something recently. I had to look up an email about a lease. Guess what? I got every single email that I had that had the word please in it. Right. Sometimes people say please. So, I mean, it's not an effective.
Right, but didn't you just modify your search and add the space to being in there?
Yeah. The first round is like, wait a minute.
this doesn't have lease in it, right? And and what we're not necessarily having Casey do the search. We're having a curator do the search that may not be an effective user of information sources. Aaron?
Can I just ask a question, because I came in a bit late?
Yeah.
But, I mean, in terms of preservation, I mean, if you're just talking about preserving the raw email, that one's solved.
Yeah, that's what we're
Except to the fact that a lot of email has attachments, and so we have to.
That's solved. No, but in terms of just raw preservation, that's solved. Trying to figure out how to do anything with them is a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, I think that we've established that there's a difference between the sort of, bulk email,
I mean,
save and recover mode and knowledge.
Today.
And other people are dealing with that problem, right? I mean, our problem, that problem is not sector specific.
When we say, I'm a little dense, so when we say it's solved, how do you mean?
Well,
it's storage.
Like the auto archiving.
Yep.
And the.
It's just IMAP and POP and all of them.
Right, but the file formats may change.
Yeah.
But yes, but there's been a change in every sector, most of which are spending massively more than we ever will on a problem.
But I mean, the problem is everybody's using Exchange, Aaron. It's not like everybody's. Yeah. So even if we say, well, the process is that you take these emails out of the system and store them in some other system, we have to talk about, which one of those is.
Actually, your assumption isn't necessarily right. You said everybody who uses Exchange.
Right, Lotus Notes. Right.
I don't, right? I mean, I have every email in multiple places from 1994 that I've ever exchanged with anybody, right? And I have a backup locally. I have a backup of this drive. I have a backup IMAP on a server, and that server is also backed up. And I have 30-day running backup totals for
You do. But that's really the exception.
But that's a viable model, right? I'm actually saying that because I've never went down that.
I mean, for a whole corporation, is that a real viable model?
Sure, I've done it with a 30-person corporation. I've done it with a 40-person corporation.
I'm going to add
right,
something.
I mean, at the end of the day, disk space is cheap. Right? I mean, that's not the real limitation.
I agree with that. But I'm not necessarily concerned about the storage aspects of this per se, as opposed to the supported file formats and how do you actually say, this file is going to be accessible 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now.
Withstood some test of time. Yeah, Inbox works.
I'm going to add something that you probably didn't think of, is access to information. There's all kinds of layers. I come from federal government, and we are obliged, and we keep every piece of email that we've got to provide this to the public. And there's a thought that they don't want to have to do that in perpetuity. So emails is an easy way of saying we keep them 3 years, they're gone. So we're going to have to rethink the way that some of the data that we've got that might have some historical context is preserved somewhere else, because there's a whole big thing when it comes to access to information. So there's legislation involved around that, so that's another issue that many organizations are going to have to deal with.
Well, there's definitely regulatory reasons to keep email, and the institutions are actually doing that. We talked a little bit earlier about records management practice. But, I mean, kind of from a preservation standpoint, I'm still not convinced that we know, while inboxes are good, when we start talking about being able then to access that information across multiple persons, whether you're dumping, a billion emails from an organization into one big system is kind of actually the way to go, and whether that's something that's going to be available 20 years from now, kind of, and be able to handle that kind of quantity.
Rich?
Yes.
I mean, one of the things that I would suggest is that we may be reaching a point in sort of the digital maturation process where we need to start changing individual worker practices the same way my mom was an office manager, and they decided that the advertisements for a new IBM typewriter didn't need to be saved correspondence, but there was other correspondence that did need to be saved. It got chronologically tagged. It got project or keyword tagged in a sense, and it was physically filed, and that was part of each worker's job to do that. And when that file folder got to too big, or if the particular paper it was typed on got too deteriorated, it was transcribed onto a new piece of paper. And that, so those analog practices have many digital equivalents. And that, we all got caught up in email, and it all developed so quickly, and it was all so handy, and it was great, but the sort of institutional practice of thinking about your responsibility as a worker and how to file and keep track of your correspondence and the correspondence that's coming to you didn't catch up. So I'm just saying there are worker practices that need to mature along with the digital system.
I think the challenge with that is kind of what we already heard here, but I mean, even if you think about places where it's regulatory, from a regulatory standpoint, it's mandated.
The banks,
the Bush White House.
Yeah.
I mean, there is an active amount of work to actually, for people, to avoid that system.
Right.
And either through, I don't have the time, or I don't want my email recorded, or a number of different things. I think as an institution, if we can create other ways of doing it, I think they would be better. I'm not saying that in a perfect world, I don't wish that that's what's happening, and that we shouldn't, maybe that's one of the intern steps that we try to take. But I just worry that the people I work with not doing it.
I think it's actually worth
more likely at the director level.
Looking at those workflow modes in order to try to model the sorts of things that we would hope to automate or ask machines to do for us. Because I agree that, I said at the top of the hour, I think people will subvert those kinds of requirements, particularly museums where we're accustomed, to willfully ignoring rules, administrative rules. But I do think that I do think that the model, at least, is something that you want to put in place, because we don't even have that. So we can't even know what we're thinking we want machines to do for us. And so I'm for that kind of that step.
Can I ask an IT question that maybe all of you can ask, but I don't know right offhand? And that is that when something goes on Exchange, is there metadata that talks about sort of what version and what operating system that was created on, so that there can be anytime an operating system changes, an emulator could, for example, be run so that all of those expiring operating systems could be then emulated in the new operating system just based on the metadata tags?
I don't know about an email. Basically, we're talking about, I would imagine, an email header.
Yeah, it
does it keep track of the version of the software that creates it?
It does, yes.
So that's one easy automation for preservation.
Right, is migration. Right.
Yeah, the important thing to remember is everyone's dealing with Exchange at the ends,
but in between.
It's the same format going across the wire.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right, and so one of the ideas there is that you catch it while it's going across the wire, and you duplicate it on the ingest, and then there's a repository that it then goes into. That is one of those longer lasting standards, including kind of the MIME standards and stuff like that would support the attachments.
But it would be dependent on the creator and user.
No, we could do it on the recipient end. So the museum being the recipient of an email or the generator of an email. Basically the Exchange server is saying, I got this email, I look at the header, I know it's going there. But the challenge, we were talking about this a little earlier, and the challenge that exists there is some of the communication goes across the wire that way. But a good chunk of it goes between users on the Exchange server. So you'd actually have to figure out a way to make the Exchange server dump a copy as well into a repository for the internal communication, which is not something that's standard.
I think too, there's just hearing about knowledge and information. I think that the information becomes infinitely more valuable if some meaning or context is assigned to those pieces of information. And so about the federal government, they've done a ton from a records management perspective and getting out good records practices. And they would say follow the money, right? So legal and defense are two areas that a ton of work is being done with regards to getting this information together, aggregated, and then using data mining tools. And those are starting to catch up. Those are starting to get there, but they're still not there. But I think getting back to that social behavior and
people, I mean, when I have a folder set and I go through each day and I try to keep up, it's never going to be perfect, but I'm going to get the bulk of good stuff filed where the transactional, operational things can just go.
So I go back to thinking that it has to be a user-generated workflow, because if we're gonna just store everything from the server in, you're just gonna have data and data and data, and when it comes to searchable, it's not going to be. And at the end, we just have to bring it back to the user to say, okay, if you're working on a project, you work in an exhibition, you need to take the responsibility. When you close this project, you archive what needs to be archived as part of that project too.
But where do they archive it to?
Files.
I mean, are they going to print all these?
Well, you have document document management, and there's file formats. PDF/A, which is an iOS standard already, is developed and is being used out there already. And you could archive whether it's email or any document type, and it's searchable, and that would be something that could be used.
And that could be automated.
Correct.
But isn't there's all this idea, all right, so we're assuming that emails in some respects have replaced written communication, what we're saying correspondence, which has been letters. But there's this whole group of emails that replaced phone conversations, which we never would have preserved to begin with. So why are we concerned about them now? You know, these would have been offline conversations.
Well, phone conversations, phone conversations on some level replace letters too. I mean, and so, maybe we missed the boat with those phone conversations, but instead of, that we don't, yeah.
Right. Well, but I think, what I would say to that is, they're just from a paper conversation standpoint, there's things that just stopped being correspondence. Phone conversations replaced in-person conversations. So those, it would be nice, it's actually probably worthwhile to actually say that some of these conversations that are happening over the phone or over Skype,
that's what I'm saying.
It would be ideal to actually be archiving them.
Yeah, Nixon archived all the time.
Yeah, that's right.
Some of the best material ever, right? But
LBJs are better.
I think it would be pretty good if we could just get email at this point. And one of the questions I guess I have, so you'd have to have a system if you were using, say, for instance, PDF-A, that takes the attachments as much as possible and actually converts them as well as the email. And perhaps there's I use an email archiving tool that actually extracts the stuff out of the PST files, which are the archival format files for Exchange, for Outlook, and allows me to dump them all out into file structure so that they're text files. But of course, you lose a lot of the attachments, which in a lot of cases, the email content is the attachment, right?
Yeah.
And I think that potentially is a big issue.
What about pictures? In museums, I'm finding curators and conservators are using pictures, and you can end up with files that are in the 15, 20, 100 meg size.
Right.
And those pictures are presumably, in many cases,
They're key
contain critical information.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So just two comments. One is the picture thing. So for a million years ago, I worked at Flickr, and I dealt with the upload by email handler. Oh my God, right? It's just a nightmare. The other one is Jason Scott of the archive team in the Internet Archive, text files. He's got a project going on right now around file formats for the month of November, where basically it's just like, seriously, let's all just write down what we know in one place. And that would be fantastically useful for email. And I can vouch for that, having had to do upload by email, because it's the combination of where it's coming from, what format it's in, what the MIME attachment is like, and just having that's the first step, research.
Interesting. Because there was a recent thing that came out was talking about it was basically doing research into the demise of certain types of file formats from the UK, which was, and the answer was that the popular file formats are not going away. So that was one. That kind of undermines my argument earlier that you got to worry about particular formats. But that, you know, certain file formats, once they became popular and used, they have basically remained. And they haven't degraded, gone away, been converted, been changed in a way that, you know, keeps new viewers from reading old files. Something like 95% of the file formats that became prevalent just stayed. So, anyway, that's one thing.
Well, it's the question of vendor lock-in. I mean, Stamps keeps getting tossed around, but Apple switched to Mbox to be some slight variation of it. But no one's quite, you know, called Mbox X, and no one's quite sure what to do about it.
So, we talked a little bit about access, and let's see how we're doing on time. So we're pretty good.
Yeah, I'm just going to send around a piece of paper to gather names and email addresses, because I think that, you know, before you all start to leave early, our goal was actually to continue this conversation. We had put together a proposal to do some exploratory work on this problem, the MLS, and we got it back with incredibly high scores and a rejection. We're going to try again.
It's like, absolutely, we need to do this.
So does anybody have,
Right.
you know, unfortunately,
But
the
we're not
panel's
gonna fund
over.
it.
Does anybody have a piece of blank?
I do.
Yes, I'm sorry, guys. That's what
Nobody
we've been
carry
doing.
papers anymore.
Meanwhile, Bruce is sending me every one of the first 5 emails I ever sent him. Thank you.
No, send the whole thing so they can go.
Yes, yeah, we'd like to stay in touch with you guys.
It was nice to read the origins of those.
Oh, yes, indeed. Also that we intended it for a family event to take place.
Yes, yes.
Does anybody want to continue that discussion on the role of research in solving this problem? Because I think it's actually a really good idea. I like that idea.
I mean, that's what our proposal to the MLS was. Was a research proposal.
Anybody who, in fact,
To get people from the archival community, from the conservation community, from the business community that have already, you know, the vendors that have worked on this, all in a room and kind of have this discussion. Yes?
I'm from the Library of Congress, and we don't have solutions lined up, but I just wanted to throw it out there that we do have a digital preservation program, and we do a lot of, right now we're kind of doing a lot of information gathering, posting others' results and work on digitalpreservation.gov.
Which is a fantastic site, by the way.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Unfortunately, I'm thinking as we're talking here, I really wanted to go on there and remind myself about some stuff up. The site is down already.
Yeah. Got that email.
So I can't give you very specific answers on on too much of it right now. I wanted to look it up, but for future reference.
And to be clear, I mean, there have been other projects that have kind of tried to tap into this from the Smithsonian. There was another museum group that did some work, but they basically petered out after the funding ran out. So they ended up being more of projects to try and work on it, but that, you know, found that the problem was immense and hard, and they were able to make progress in certain aspects of it, but not kind of really solve and create any things that people could actually use. Kind of.
Right, and like I said, we don't have those solutions yet, especially for institutions. We're attempting to do it on an individual level, on personal digital archiving. So we've got a section where we offer advice about how to archive your personal digital items, all different formats, photos and documents and email. And there's a lot of similarities. It's very on a very high level, very basic.
Right.
For people less technical than those in this room.
I mean, the other thing is that ISO, you know, ISO is continually working to evaluate and come up with international standards of archivability, so that, you know, for example, from the photo world, digital negative file format, which automatically embeds in a permanent way the metadata of a photograph, is the ISO standard for digital preservation. Everybody's agreed that that file format will continue to, you know, to be the file format from which everything can be built in the future. So that's literally how we, regardless if we take it as a TIFF or a RAW, we're saving photographs as DNGs. That is the file that gets saved. And, you know, so that is another organization that really is thinking about these in very sophisticated ways that it would behoove us to collaborate with, because it's an international standard, and I think that's what we have to think about.
The National Archives is also working and mandated by the president to figure out how all the executive offices and agencies will manage their electronic records. So that just actually came out probably about 2 months ago, 3 months ago. They kicked that off, and they've given themselves plenty of time, 6 years to work on it.
Now, this goes to something that we knew all along, which is that there's a great deal of stuff happening out there, and a great deal of information, and that one of the things that we need to just be is a clearinghouse for that information, while at the same time figuring out those things that are sector-specific, you know, requirements and problems. So we will also share, I think we have a pretty good bibliography.
Yep, absolutely. And so let's leave preservation for a little bit, and let's talk about access, because I think it is one of the more domain-specific. There are a lot of domain-specific things that I think about when I think about an art museum accessing their email archive. But I'd like to get some thoughts from other people on kind of what you think about from an access standpoint. What do you think the problems are that need to be solved?
Well, the person leaves the institution, they're the ones that have the major access. How do you transfer the access around? What rules and regulations do you have to make sure it goes to it?
Okay.
Well, and should they actually have held that access throughout their tenure at the institution? Right?
Yeah.
That's that logic.
Right.
What are the privacy
I think
issues
pretty
around
much
that?
a lot of organizations that do have institutional policies say, hey, your email is ours anyway.
Yeah.
So, but you never have anybody else with access to that person's email until they do leave. I mean, I'd be surprised unless there was a court case where somebody's digging through your email for it.
And yet, no matter how much you say that,
that's a model. Yeah.
It's a model, and I've seen a lot of personal email within the business email sections. And is there something wrong with it? No, but what happens when all that data has to be moved over to the next director?
Right. That's why directors delete their inboxes. Yeah.
I was just going to say, you're finding that the younger generations are really able to adapt to regulation and policy, especially on digital mediums, a lot better than, let's say, older generations, just because it's what we're born into, is what we're used to. So instituting policy and saying you are required to have a professional, a business email and a personal email, and make those distinctions, and say that from the beginning, make it readily apparent, and have them sign off on that as part of their, their whole, contract. I think that's something that you might want to consider.
I mean, if they're doing it anyway, if they're stupid, then you need to help them by telling them.
Right, exactly.
Right. Well, I mean, it's pretty rare today that a person coming into doesn't already have 2 to 3 email addresses anyway.
Exactly.
Well, that's is and it isn't true. I mean, I know actually several people within my organization that use their business email as their primary email, and when they move to another job, they just get a new email. It's like it's not as much a personal identifier for, I think, older. I don't think it's as much of a problem for sort of more natives or whatever, but I think it is a bit of an issue.
But would you have any problem instituting a rule that changed that?
No, I wouldn't at all. And actually, that's a very simple and elegant solution to a problem that I kind of sort of avoid thinking about mostly. But just saying, don't use our system for personal email. Here's
the reasons.
Here's how to set up a Gmail.
Right. I think also along with that, instead of just making it an abstract rule, I mean, talking about the reasons why the policies are changing in that direction to make it more effective as a museum tool is one way of probably mitigating some of the backlash that. It's going to be a challenge. I mean, it's some institutions, it'll be hard to get that institutional buy-in at the top, maybe.
Yeah, we actually have that in our technology policy, but we don't enforce it.
Right.
Unless, we'll go to somebody's desk or we going through emails for whatever reason and find things that we find inappropriate, and then I'll actually take it upon myself to just have a side conversation with them and say, hey, I would recommend you use a personal email for all this.
But it is in your technology
for your bondage
policy.
list.
It is.
Would you be willing to share that?
Oh, absolutely.
It's in our technology policy too. But it's not the reality.
Yeah, I mean,
Exactly.
pretty much every
Exactly.
organization says, your email is for business use. And,
Correct.
And it's hard to.
but that's different than saying you're required to have an outside email address.
For your personal use.
For your personal
They
use.
should have no expectation of privacy.
That's all. That's usually in the policy. That's pretty much in the policy. And,
That's exactly correct.
but it's not just that. I mean, it's actually, we're talking about requesting that people do that because it's going to make it easier for us to develop access models.
And you're not
You build
capturing.
yourself into another problem, which I have with my current CEO, which he will interchangeably use his personal email account and work email account to send correspondence back and forth, and you're like, wow,
Yeah.
this is a new problem.
Yeah.
I will say
Especially when
that,
you're just trying to search for something from that person.
I mean,
Yeah,
what,
well, usually it's going inside, but if it's not ever flowing to our server, I never know that it happened.
Right.
So he could be corresponding with another director about business for the History Center using his personal account and their corporate, and we never get a track.
yeah, and you won't, and you won't. I mean,
Right.
I have no idea. But, I mean, one of the things I will say is that there are, in our institution, and we're not governmental, so, we're not covered by transparency rules. But so there are relationships with potential donors, with bequesters. Somebody who has willed a painting to the museum, they don't necessarily want their sisters, brothers, siblings, or children to know that they've done that. A promised gift, a major financial promised gift, where there's discussions between the director, the development director. Those kinds of things really should have limited access, at least for some period of time. And there is no automated way that those things get sort of organized and archived in a formal manner for us. I don't know if anybody else does that, but
You don't have a system of tags that you can
Yeah.
apply that.
But I think that does come back to what you were saying about having some manual processes, and I think,
Yeah.
so one way of kind of articulating that is that any system that we think up should have hybrid options for kind of managing sensitivity, I guess, is probably the more, because from a research standpoint, at one point, you do want to have access to all of that
You
stuff.
bet.
So 20 years from now, when there's a question about that
Right.
work,
Right.
and the family is trying, said, no, we just loaned it to you, we actually want it back, well, which happens. And,
it does.
you want to be able to search the full corpus
Full discussion.
of all of the discussions, but knowing that in the interim, you don't want the IT manager poking around and finding that out.
Yeah, or
or making it difficult.
or the donor
trackable.
really doesn't want his children to know that he's promised the major portion of what they see as their inheritance to a museum.
Right, but this must be maybe after the donor dies, and they're
Right.
trying to get the artwork back because of that.
Right.
They actually do need to know
Exactly right, Rich.
that there's legitimate reasons for that to have happened.
Okay,
Yeah.
lots of hands.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the ambition should be, we've spoken about a manual intervention to improve the findability of the documents in archival systems. Is the ambition to make this system user-proof? So that on the flip side, a user can completely destroy your stuff by deleting their mailbox. Should this stuff be done at the point the email is received?
I think it should be.
Cannot work around the policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right.
Yes, I think ultimately, yes. I mean,
I
is
think
there
you-
anybody who disagrees with that?
No.
I think you could also use kind of some of the manual processy to create an augmentation of that automated process. So in other words, if somebody does tag something, or is willing to tag something,
Sure want that
or
saved.
follows the rules, which does create another kind of issue, because in that scenario, we have an email in a giant store, and then we have an email in what we'll call a local store, even though it may be connected on the Exchange server. But fundamentally, the only thing that can get access to it is the backup routine. You kind of have this disconnect, because if so, they're tagging that data, but the actual stored permanent email is over here.
Is untagged.
Untagged, and so you have to figure out a way to actually get that information across, which is a pretty tricky problem, I think, yeah.
I mean, unless you're going to scope the problem to, like, the current version of Exchange, I would stay away from anything that gets down to the client level. I mean, trying to do things at the email client level is just asking. I mean, that's a full-time job. You could build an entire corporation on top of that.
Well, I mean, there are email archiving corporations, right? I mean, that's
Yeah, but if you're talking about capturing email as it comes in over the wire, and then sync it after the fact once it's gotten to someone's desktop. I just think
it's impossible.
It's a nice idea, but I don't think it's worth doing right now. And the other comment I would have is more of a question is, you know, is the answer something like the equivalent of the 7-year rule, with the exceptions being, you know, senior management or executive has access, or a legal case. And after that, it's just like it's dark until it's light.
Well, I think there's research that sometimes is done 20 years out, 30 years out. That's the main reason that I would imagine doing this is not so much for 70 years out, although that's important too. But I think it starts happening sooner than that.
I mean, it's ultimately relationship management at the end of the day.
Right.
You know, it is, are the people that you're trying to do business with going to get freaked out when correspondence?
Well, I think another way of talking about that might be that, I mean, you know, if this conversation that hypothesizing happened 30 years ago, it would have been documented in a letter. Probably, maybe it would.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Or it might have been a verbal comment. It probably would have been documented in a letter. It would be in the archives, and decisions are made when somebody goes to search the archive what they're allowed to actually access. And so it's not like it's necessarily an outside person can just access anything. There's an archivist saying you can access what's in this box, and in certain cases you can't take this box. You can't bring any paper in with you, and you can't take any paper out with you. And you know, I mean, depends on what it is, but sometimes that's as harsh as it gets. So the question would be, could you build those? I mean, it shouldn't be hard to build those kinds of tools in where the research archivist is actually looking through the emails and saying, this is viewable by this profile, this is viewable, this is viewable.
Just gonna, I mean, WikiLeaks. just saying.
Yeah. No, right. That's true. I mean, it's different. It's different in the sense that archives on paper are easier to secure, probably. And somebody could dump your whole museums. I mean, and that's going to be one of the questions. I mean, we have the last bullet, which is privacy. But I still want to dig a little more on access and kind of automated access and algorithmic access, and kind of, you know, how people could imagine us building tool sets on top of this to access it. I mean, my imagination is Watson. You have a machine that can actually look through it. And there was an exhibition 2 years ago, and it uses its octopus hands to kind of pull together everything from everybody, and you ask it a question like, you know, who talked to the artist? And it's able to surface up, you know, all of the correspondence where somebody was actually communicating with the artist. Yes?
I think one of the challenges with that idea is that unless people are using a controlled vocabulary of some type, it just
That's going to be really
challenging.
challenging.
False positives, and the return just, I mean, for the human to go through at some point is
Are there any examples in other than this Watson medical idea that, and I don't really know how it works, in other domains that they're doing this, that people know about? Yeah.
The Ngram viewer. I mean, you go back to your question about controlled vocabularies. Email has the advantage of coming with a fairly limited one, but the headers can double as that.
What was the Ngram viewer?
The Google Ngram viewer.
Okay.
Just something to start to see the relationships between one term and another.
I think in some cases, maybe if you could emulate the original system, and I'm thinking of recently, our IT folks had to go, they had a PST file, and they were looking specifically for messages where one person was in either the to, from, or the CC of the message. And they were able to hone in pretty quickly on that because they were doing the search through Outlook. 50 years from now, it's going to be some other client, but if you can emulate that original.
Well, that is the only controlled vocabulary. I mean, the problems that because you can use that on desktop search if you're in a Microsoft platform and you type in Rich Cherry, you're going to get all of the emails sorted, you know, that were to me. But what you'll find, I mean, where I see that falling down mostly is the multi-email use for people, especially for my last, you know, 7 months of my, or 8 months of my life. I've had, you know, my museums and the web stuff going on, and I'm, you know, switching jobs and changing, and I'm like trying to figure out, who was I when I sent that? You know, what capacity was I acting in, and kind of, so that it comes back to the outside email and things like that. So if that can make a challenge. I mean, you think about like the Indianapolis Museum of Art for a while had different domains that they were using for sending their email, and that actually made like desktop search actually search it and group it in different groups. So it was like, Rob Stein was actually 3 different people from one organization because it depended on what email address kind of got put together on the outgoing email.
We also have different languages, especially in Canada, where I might send somebody something in English, somebody will reply to me in French, and back and forth, and you have to try to categorize that. And
even the same keywords are different.
Yeah.
Unless you have a glossary or a thesaurus, which is just another layer of controlled vocabulary.
Yeah. I mean,
I know, but the whole thing is the more you build on top, the more it can all collapse.
From a preservation standpoint.
But we're talking about access now. We're on the access side now.
Yeah.
No, the more complicated it is, the more. What I found is you add these layers and it actually performs the job you want it to do. But on the access side, all of a sudden you end up with holes you never expected. Right. And and the worst part is that as the people involved in the IT shop, you are probably going to be the last one to know that there are these holes. And it's going to come out in some really horrible way, and then you have to act quickly to solve it all. You may have to strip everything back and then rebuild. Automation is important, but sometimes it can really complicate your lives.
I'm wondering too, I mean, we talk about all these different systems and stuff, and it seems like, from what I've seen in some more recent conferences, like BDI, which is that stuff from Views, with VMware Views, and the stuff where they're pushing basically the whole desktop, you can use your own hardware and all of that stuff, gives you an ability to centralize all of your data in one location. And so now what we're missing, it seems like, is that tool that you guys are looking for to search through it all once you have that centralized store of all of that huge amount of data.
Well, but even on there's commercial tools, but on the average Exchange server, as an administrator, you're not really, without a special tool set, you're not able to access any of the information. Right? So that's a centralized store of a lot of data that you can back up, but you can't really access, and that's intentional. They've put layers of security and stuff like that, so that people aren't hanging out and playing around with other people's emails.
Well, technically, if you have the desktops that you're publishing, which is like a Windows 7 desktop, you have a PST file on a machine, which technically is indexable and searchable through Windows Search. The question really is then, can you actually search the VHD file, all of those?
Well, a PST file is searchable through Windows Search when it's open.
True. There actually are ones that you can do it close to, but yeah.
For me, I don't know, I feel like I want this shit out of files as quickly as I can.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. It should be. My feeling is certainly for the stuff that I'm preserving long term, like the true intellectual property of the museum, when there's discussions around exhibitions or something like that.
The artist's intention.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
That stuff, for me, when I think about algorithms or machine learning, what I want is I want something that's sort of looking at that incoming stream and saying, okay, this goes onto your internal knowledge base, that wiki page or whatever, so that it's I've just got a page with pages, whatever, with all that text in it and all the links are internally.
Right, and you're writing other things.
That's my access. My access isn't how do I get into that file store? My access is, I'm searching right there in whatever that is.
Well, and particularly because so far we keep talking about models in which what we are searching is an email file store, and I just think, I want all of the other pieces of incoming information, about this piece of knowledge grouped together, not all of the emails.
So you want the physical document record, the archival record for the document, the actual artwork all linked across this? Is that what you're saying, or am I misunderstanding?
Yeah, I don't really know what you were saying.
So you're saying I don't understand what you guys are saying. So let's try and line into this.
Okay, so right now, just at a very simple level, I use if this then that to basically create an automatic journal of things that I do. So if I can send an email to somebody else or to myself, and if I tag it a certain way, it basically creates a Google document with just sort of successive entries that are all dated and things like that. I want essentially that at a much larger, on a much.
You want an institutional journal.
Larger scale.
Yeah.
Well, yes and no, but for certain types of content.
Yeah.
You want to
apply those.
You know, say this needs to go to the institutional archive first.
Right.
Right.
This goes to the object, this goes to the.
Yeah, except that actually I want an automated process to do that for me. I don't want that to be contingent, and I accept that.
But how is that different than sending every email to the archival store and then accessing what you need later on based on algorithms?
Or even applying those business rules before it gets into the archive.
But
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Because I think there's sort of two issues here. Like for me, yeah, I need to retain all the emails for legal purposes and whatever, and those are according to my retention policy. But there's a sort of intellectual content piece of this where the level of access that's required for that is significantly higher. Where it's like, okay, this actually now becomes a regular sort of referential document.
Right.
As opposed to something that just for legal reasons I might need to search later, years out.
It's a replacement for the object file, which is an incredibly important piece of knowledge within an organization, but it contains known kinds of things. We know what goes in that file. It's only that kind of stuff. Sorry, Aaron.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, that's fine. But if we're going to go down that road, then I think it's worth calling out at the top of the document header, that we are sacrificing tomorrow's business rules for today's. Because what you're saying is, I'm going to develop a series of rules today. Email will come in, the email will get manipulated, stuff will happen, the email will get sucked into the vortex. And that's fine. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. But understand that you won't ever get that email back, and so that gets back to your heart.
Why wouldn't you? It's still part of the raw archive that's archived.
If you say that something is only
saying the same thing. At some point, the raw email has to get archived somewhere. It's stored like this. And so you come back to it to apply new business rules. So it's just the layers of.
I mean, there's going to be smarter computers 10 years from now that's going to be able to create things out of all of the emails if you decide now to get rid of something.
I don't think that Code was suggesting.
Okay, well, that's what it sounds like. That's kind of what it sounds like. That's why I'm saying I'm not understanding what.
He's saying that that one wants to know that you do have these business rules.
Well, it sounded like you want to manipulate the data, though.
Yeah, that's what I was hearing.
So I think of the system that I'm talking about as creating that journal in an automated fashion on the entire store, and looking at it and saying, because during this month there was 150 emails from 7 different people about the Picasso exhibit. That's a data point that is worth noting at the meta level, and is to say, it's easy, and in an imaginary world where everything's wonderful, it could actually be like looking at your social media stream and all of those other things and saying, this is what's happening now. This is the business of the museum for some period of time, and so I should actually work really hard to kind of connect all these dots together.
I don't think the two scenarios you've described are mutually exclusive.
But what I'm saying is I don't understand the other scenario. What's the other scenario? What's the scenario that you guys are talking about?
It's actually just a use case using the same kinds of tools that is specific to that it is just essentially what Aaron was saying. You're saying we're gonna act on the archive to apply a set of business rules in order to separate things out in a particular way. Your way does one thing, and Coven's describing something different. And
but I don't.
You can have the raw repository that just sits there, and you can also have some manipulated processes in it.
Oh, I see what you said. Okay.
It's just like a true archive is. I mean, we're a history center, so we have an archives. We have masses of shelves that are uncatalogued and processed. They're just sitting there raw. We have all the process.
Okay, got it. Okay, no, that makes sense.
It's
process. That's exactly right.
Especially with when you're talking about these records, inter pares, I don't know if you know this project, is the authentication of electronic records. And so inter pares was a huge project by the archival community to say, how do you authenticate an electronic record when it is easily manipulatable? Because when you're talking about a record, you have to make sure its authenticity is correct.
Interesting.
And that it is a valid record. Because when you're talking about electronic records, I had to deal with this with a lot of
easy to change an email for sure.
Manipulate records to, undermine them. or change the metadata in terms of when it was sent and who it was sent by. So you can't, I mean, I think using manipulate is a really disingenuous term when it comes to electronic records, only because the authentication process, when you're dealing with, you know, exporting to a different format and dealing with so many different hands, is you have to make sure that the record is still authentic in a legal sense, but also in a integral sense to the record itself. And I think when you're dealing with electronic records, you have to know, you know, this goes back to archival principles of provenance, who it went to, who it was by, and also what it's for. And I think, you know, with electronic records, I mean, I think it functions in the same way that your museum functions or your business functions or your corporation functions. Then you have to go back to the basics and say, what is this record for and who is it by? And in the stream of everyday business management, where does it fit into? And you have to go back to the sort of functional analysis of your institution and say, who sent that out and who did it come to? And I think if you go back to the nuts and bolts, if you facet it out by departments and by user, regardless of what is captured and what is not captured, then you'll have a context for it, but you'll also have an authentication as well in that sense.
Really good point.
That's a really good point.
Speaking of archives, this reminds me of when we digitize something. You know, we always keep that master, you know, as a backup image, and you know, it's 1200 DPI, what have you, you know, TIFF. But we also have the derivatives, and then we have the access.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when he was
master, right? Master access derivative, and right. And again, going back to what I was saying, one of the first things I said, everything that comes in, everything that the institution interacts with at the end of the day is viewed as an artifact. That email is a digital artifact, and if you treat it as such, you know, you have that original and it's over there and that's fine. But then you take that derivative and you mess around with it, and it's as a metadata applied to it, saying as such on the back end, this is a derivative and it's, you know, manipulated. I'm sorry, we need to come up with a better term.
Process.
Process.
There we go. That's what all of them say anyway.
Okay. Perfect. You know, it's a process. It's a process derivative, and for the system to be able to articulate that and manage that in the back end, I think is something that would have to be built in and codified and then implemented.
And going back to your point for authentication, I mean, if you look at all the SOX, you know, compliance stuff, I mean, immutability is one of the key things. And so there are tools that's out there to...
There are, and there's a lot of studies that have done authentication of electronic documents. You know, and that's going to be crucial when you're trying to make a legal case for why this is important. Right. Someone will tell you, oh, you can manipulate those records so they're not. Their veracity is questioned. When you have to have an internal way of authenticating it as a true document.
One more point, and the gentleman, he's since left, but said he has the back up here and the back there. When you've got those three versions that you just said, then you have the backup, and then you have a geo backup. You've got now 9 versions essentially of the same original file. Right. So storage, while yes, inexpensive, can get very expensive when you get into 9, 12 versions of the same.
And so you're just transferring the problem down the line to somebody else.
Good. That's okay.
That's okay.
That's okay. We do that all the time with our collections anyway.
I mean, we have about talking about the museum profession after.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to just touch on one piece that one bullet point that we haven't kind of dug into, and it's talking about the human factor of people not wanting their email to be archived, and we kind of have touched around some of the issues around it, and I'd just be interested in a couple of comments from everyone on, you know, is it just policy and we don't care?
Yes.
But except that the policy will have to be authorized by probably one of the people who doesn't want necessarily their email being accessed, which is the director.
But is it the director's choice or is it the board's choice? Who's the fiduciary? That's right. Fiduciary.
Oh, there you go.
The board.
Yeah, so they definitely want all their communication that they've had with the director to be archived and available.
I mean, it's a governance issue.
Yeah.
Right.
To the bylaws of the organization.
Well, and it goes back to that privacy policy that you have. I mean, we have a really, really rigorous privacy policy that says you have no expectation of privacy. Everything that you do in the context of your work belongs to the organization. And that's sort of like the law.
And almost all these trustees work for people that are under, sorry conflict.
Yeah.
They know, they can't, they don't have a choice.
Right, they don't even realize, most of the time, they don't realize that museums don't fall under that.
Right.
Yes.
So, I mean,
Precisely.
Well, it's a self-governing practice.
Right.
For museums, unlike the medical field where it's, you know,
The law,
required,
it's the
yeah.
law. Well, I mean, it's to a certain extent, at some point, they're gonna do it to us anyway. I mean, it is gonna be the law.
You know, it's interesting to talk about regulation as opposed to institutional policy applied in other ways. So, okay, yeah, absolutely, you know, you have the right to archive this stuff and, you know, in theory to access it, but to whom you give access, and, you know, who you give access to, what kind of content is accessed by whom. These are more sensitive issues, and they're not the ones that are covered by these policies. You know, and I have to say that I do think that it's a tricky thing because work process, in many ways, does have some elements that you would like to believe, you know, are, except in the case of, you know, legal challenge, protected. I mean, our curators do all kinds of correspondence that is speculative with potential donors, but you know, but with artists. I think.
But that's not only that. You've got financial, you've got human resources material there too. That, you know, I mean, it's not only directed to collections and that. There's a lot of other things too, and you're dictated as well that when an employee leaves, some of that stuff has to go away. So, I mean, you have to be able to segregate some of that data because you can't possibly keep it. You know, in personnel files, you know, after a while they go away. I know ours are, you know, gone through and, you know, flushed out every 3-4 years. On your,
but there should be, I mean, we should be able to tap into what the commercial industry has done in that regard.
Yeah, I agree.
Except that, I mean, because we're trying to do these other processes on top of that, it's going to might get more complicated.
Right, that's exactly right.
And you end up with off-site archives that if you're trying to get rid of that data because of legal security or otherwise, you have to recall those off-sites, put it fully back onto the system, and then selectively take off, then put it back into an archive. Because otherwise, you can't just destroy the whole archive, you destroy all the data from that time.
Right.
We should let people go early, shouldn't we?
Okay.
I mean, really, you want to make sense.
Burning issues? I mean,
anything we didn't talk about?
Exactly.
Bullet point that we didn't have?
I would just say that I think it's worth scaling the problem to start, scaling the problem down to not archiving all of space and time.
Yeah.
Because it's going to fall into this. I mean, I was just thinking like, why are we doing this? We're doing this around the material that went into an exhibition. Then maybe the project is to archive stuff leading up to the exhibition, building something afterwards, and then, like the person from the government of Canada is saying, jettisoning it. You are in effect creating a new thing.
Although you do with collections.
Yeah, I'm thinking out loud. Sorry.
No, exhibitions is one thing, but with permanent collection object files, that persists through time. Like, so even if you're part of work in the 60s, like 80 years from now, you could still be collecting.
I guess that's why I'm saying we need to scale the project down in scope so that there is some acceptable loss in order so that we can move forward.
Well, I really like the idea of defining an
acceptable loss.
Project that you know, which we can test some of these.
We have to test it, I think. Yeah, I mean, that's going to be one way, is actually having data to work with and actually test it. So my email is up on the thing. Hopefully you have your email on the sheet. If for some reason you don't hear from us, I'm going to be reaching out to all of you, talking about getting access to email stores, potentially for some testing. Well, I am. So that we can in a controlled environment.
Yeah. Controlled environment. Well, that leaves Bruce out of it entirely.
We're going to make 7 copies. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.